Here's 5 minutes or so on Roman taxation. In the Republic, there was no income tax on Roman citizens. However, they would have to pay tax on property, specifically land that they owned. After 167 BCE, um, presumably because revenue from the provinces was so lucrative because Roman territories had expanded so much, even the property tax was done away with. So average Roman citizens didn't have to pay any direct taxation at all. They did have to pay tax indirectly. The two on the screen are worth knowing about. The first one, Portoria, 2.5% customs tax on goods going into or out of Roman territory, and the Aesaxorium, which was sort of a tax on being single, which is really strange to our ears. But the intention behind it was to encourage more people to marry. It is worth looking that one up in greater depth, but for our purposes, it's enough to know that there was tax on being single. Augustus introduced a number of taxes of his own. The Vicesima Hereditatium, which is tricky to say, was a 5% inheritance tax, but it wasn't applied to close relatives. So if your father died, you didn't have to pay the inheritance tax, but if you inherited from a distant relative, then you would have to pay 5% to the Roman state. The centesimo rerum venalium was a 1% tax on everything sold at auction, and auctions were reasonably common, in fact very common in the Roman world. That did not include a taxation on slaves, which was covered in the next one, which I will try and pronounce correctly, quinta et vicesima venalium mancipiorum, which was 4% tax on selling slaves. So still no direct taxation under Augustus, but more indirect taxes. In the Roman provinces during the Republic, taxation was a bigger issue because the majority of taxes came from the provinces, because so few Roman citizens were paying direct tax themselves. But the provinces themselves didn't pay a tax per head as such. It was incumbent on the province to pay a stipendium, a tribute, a fixed sum set by the Roman state for the province to gather together. Each district within the province would raise the money however they saw fit, and that payment was made to the province's quaestor. Some cities in the provinces were given free status or ally status, so some cities still didn't pay any direct taxes at all. But it's important to note that in the provinces, it was a tribute, a fixed sum for the province to work out how to collect for themselves, because that contrasts with something we're coming to. A quick deviation to look at Sicily, Sardinia and Asia, which is, we would call it modern day Turkey. Remember, Rome couldn't grow enough grain to feed itself. So the taxation there was actually in the form of a percentage of the crops grown. These were provinces which were very rich in growing grain. So they paid a decumania, 1/10 of the crops they harvested. 1/10 of everything they grew went to Rome. Hence the Roman grain supply was maintained. Collecting tax is tricky in the ancient world. So I'm going to stick quite closely to the slide in front of us here. Taxes would vary in size, and they were not collected by the governor's staff. They would be collected by private tax companies, and these companies would buy the contract to collect all of the money at auction. These contracts were sold by the censors at auction in Rome, and each contract would run for 5 years. So the governor, say for example, he expects 5 million sesterces per year from his province. Instead of collecting that for himself, he tells the publicani The tax collectors who have the contract now, he expects 5 million. The publicani then have the responsibility to go and collect that sum. They take on all the risk. If a province is having a bad harvest and the citizens of the province simply don't have the money, then they can't collect the 5 million that the governor expects. The publicani need to make that up out of their own pocket. So in some cases, tax collectors actually make a loss on the tax they're supposed to be collecting. But the other side of the coin is also true. If the contract is to collect 5 million sesterces and the province is having a strong economic year and the publicani can actually get more money from the taxpayers within the province, then the difference, say they manage to collect 6 million sesterces, they keep 1 million sesterces, they give the 5 million to the governor. This means that the governors can be sure that every year they're going to get a certain amount through taxation. The publicani, the tax collectors, might collect more than that, but the province will produce a set level of taxation, which means that the province can financially plan. But there are problems. Some governors would extort the population, demand more money than there was necessary, to the extent that a court was established in Rome specifically to prosecute corrupt governors. Governors very often saw the role of governor, or rather the position of governor, as an opportunity to recoup money that they'd spent in climbing the cursus honorum. Remember that you could only be a governor if you had served at the upper level of that run of offices. And to get up that run of offices, you had to spend a lot of money. So some governors saw their governorship as the opportunity to make back the money they'd spent. So they would extort the provinces. Under Augustus, independent wealth through politics was less possible, simply because the governors became more directly employees of the emperor. Their advancement depended on their competence, their efficiency and their loyalty. And they had less opportunity to act as an individual to accumulate wealth for themselves. To that end, Augustus actually made a couple of reforms with regards to taxation. There were 2 direct taxes from the provinces. The first one, the tributum soli, a land tax, was introduced, but also a tributum capitis, a poll tax. That's a tax on every person who is eligible to pay tax. He also instituted regular censuses, regular counts of the population, to make sure that what he was asking of the province in terms of tax revenue was not excessive. So he actually implements a number of systems to make taxation fairer, to make extortion less possible. And in imperial provinces, the taxes were collected by a procurator, completely separate to the governor. The indirect taxes would still be collected by publicani, the tax collectors, but in the imperial era, they were increasingly supervised by government officials. So again, the opportunity for corrupting the process and for profiteering was reduced. If you have any questions, do ask me in class. There's no skinny for this one because I do think you need the detail. So take your time, run back through, take your notes, and if you still have questions, I will be in class.